Right now, somewhere in your week, you are probably counting down the hours until Friday. The average work week in most of the modern world hovers somewhere around 40 hours. Add the commute, the emails you answer after dinner. The mental space work takes up even when you're technically off the clock. And it can feel like there's barely a week left over for your own life. Sunday evening dread has practically become its own emotion, one your ancestors would have found completely baffling. Here's the number that should stop you in your tracks. For most of human history, your ancestors worked about 15 hours a week. Not 40, not 50, 15. And they weren't lounging around starving, either, wasting away between rare, desperate scrambles for food. So what were they actually doing with all that extra time? And why did we ever agree to trade it away? Let's go back to 1966, to a conference that quietly rewired how anthropologists thought about the deep past. It was called Man the Hunter, and one of the researchers presenting was a young anthropologist named Richard Lee. Lee had spent months living alongside the Johansi, sometimes called the Kung, a hunter-gatherer community in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa. This wasn't a guess or a theory. Lee did what almost nobody had done before. He counted. He tracked exactly how many hours people spent finding food, day after day, week after week, in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Kalahari isn't lush. It's dry, unforgiving, the kind of place you'd expect to demand every waking hour just to survive. Most outsiders looking at that landscape assume the people living there must be locked in a constant, exhausting battle against scarcity. His numbers said otherwise. Lee found that Juhuansi adults spent somewhere between 12 and 19 hours a week on subsistence, hunting and gathering combined. Even more strikingly, their diet wasn't scraping by either. Later nutritional surveys of similar groups found daily calorie and protein intake that comfortably exceeded modern recommended allowances. These weren't malnourished people rationing every last calorie. They were well-fed people who simply weren't spending their lives chasing more than they needed. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins took Lee's data, combined it with similar findings from Aboriginal groups in Arnhem Land, Australia, and published a paper in 1972 that anthropologists still argue about today. He called it the original Affluent Society. Think about that title for a second. Affluent. Not desperate. Not scraping by. Sahlins was making a direct, deliberate jab at the assumption everyone carried into that room. The assumption that life before agriculture was, in his words, a grim struggle for existence. The data said the opposite. Hunters, Sahlins joked, kept bankers' hours. Here's where it gets even more interesting, and where the story usually gets left out. That 15-hour number didn't just show up unquestioned. For decades, other researchers went back through these numbers and asked an obvious question. What exactly counts as work? Lee's original count only measured time spent actively hunting or gathering, walking out, tracking, digging, carrying food back to camp. It didn't count what happened after. Cracking nuts that take real effort to open. Grinding, roasting, preparing meat and roots into something edible. When later researchers, including anthropologists Kristen Hawkes and James O'Connell, added that processing time back in, the total climbed. Some estimates put the full picture closer to 40 hours a week, once you count every step from ground to mouth. So which is it? 15 hours or something closer to what you work today? The honest answer is both and neither, because the question itself is built on a modern assumption that doesn't hold up out there. You separate work from everything else. A shift starts, a shift ends, and the rest of your day is supposedly your own. That line barely existed for your ancestors at all. Picture a Juhuansi afternoon. A small group walks out from camp, not rushing, stopping to check a productive patch of mango trees they've visited for years. Someone spots tracks and mentions it. Half information, half conversation. A child tags along, half helping, half playing, learning the difference between a ripe fruit and a wasted trip just by watching. Cracking the nuts back at camp happens sitting in a loose circle, telling stories, half the group's attention on the task and half on each other. Is that work? Is it leisure? Nobody around that fire was asking the question because for them, it wasn't the question that needed an answer. That's the piece almost every retelling of the 15-hour week leaves out. It was never really about a stopwatch. It was about a life where subsistence, socializing, teaching your children, and resting were woven into the same hours instead of separated into labeled boxes. Compare that to your week. You get up, you commute, you clock in, you produce, you clock out, and the version of you that exists in between is supposed to switch off entirely from the version that exists at work. That split, work is one thing, life is an entirely separate thing, is a strange invention. It isn't ancient. It's barely a few hundred years old. So if hunter-gatherers weren't clocking in for 8-hour shifts, what were they doing with the rest of their time once food was handled one way or another? Sahlins and later researchers documented long stretches of visiting neighboring camps, extended storytelling that stretched for hours after dark, elaborate trance dances that could last all night, and children learning every skill of adulthood, not through lessons but through open, unhurried observation. Visiting relatives in a distant camp wasn't squeezed into a long weekend twice a year. It happened whenever the mood struck and the walk seemed worth it. Leisure wasn't scheduled around work. It was simply what filled the hours that survival didn't demand. The shift away from all of this didn't come from hunting and gathering being inefficient. It came later with the rise of agriculture and eventually industry, when producing a surplus, more grain than you needed, more goods than you could use yourself, became the whole point. Surplus meant storage. Storage meant ownership. Ownership meant someone had to guard it, trade it, and eventually work far longer hours to keep accumulating more of it. Where hunter-gatherers' wants were naturally capped by what a person could carry or eat before it spoiled, a farmer's granary had no such ceiling. There was always room for one more sack of grain, and always a reason to fill it. The 15-hour week didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because a new system arrived that rewarded never stopping. And once that system took hold, it never really let go, all the way up through factories, offices, and the inbox sitting open on your phone right now. Your ancestors weren't lazy, and they weren't primitive for having so much unstructured time. They had simply never been taught that more was automatically better, that a full calendar meant a full life. Their wants were met, and once met, the rest of the day belonged to them. There was no ladder to climb, no inbox refilling itself overnight. No sense that resting today meant falling behind tomorrow. That doesn't mean their lives were easy in every sense. Drought years existed. Hard seasons existed. That the daily grind of chasing more simply for the sake of more was not a feature of how they lived. Enough was an achievable ordinary state, reached most afternoons before the sun had even fully crossed the sky. You are still counting down to Friday. But somewhere in your ancestry, someone spent an ordinary Tuesday afternoon cracking nuts by a fire, telling a story they told 100 times before, in no rush at all, because the hardest part of the day was already finished by lunchtime. That's not a fantasy from a simpler age. That's the actual, measured, researched reality of how most humans lived for most of human history. The 40-hour week isn't the ancient default you were born into. It's a recent invention, barely older than your own grandparents. And somewhere underneath all your meetings and deadlines, there's still a version of you that remembers what it felt like to be done for the day by noon, with nothing left to do but sit by a fire and enjoy the time that was already, truly yours.